Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Michigan gets cold fast, and that night the temperature had dropped to near freezing by the time we reached the old Brennan Motors factory. I was 22, stuck in my hometown after college, working at a hardware store and watching my engineering degree collect dust. Every abandoned building in our dying industrial town had a story, but Brennan's was different. 15 years empty, completely untouched, like time had just stopped the day they shut it down. My friends and I had been talking about exploring it for months, and that Friday night, fueled by boredom and cheap whiskey, we finally decided to do it. There were 4 of us: Jake from the body shop, Melissa who was visiting from nursing school, and her boyfriend Connor, who thought watching Urbex videos on YouTube made him an expert on abandoned places. We knew it was stupid, we knew it was illegal, but when you're young and desperate for any kind of excitement in a town where nothing ever happens, you make stupid choices. The factory sat on 40 acres of cracked concrete and overgrown weeds, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut open so many times, it barely served a purpose anymore. We'd parked Jake's truck at a strip mall half a mile away and walked along the abandoned railroad tracks that curved behind the property. Connor had printed out satellite images and drawn a route with a red marker, through the fence near the loading docks, then into the main assembly building through a door he'd seen in someone's Instagram post from 2 years ago. The moon was almost full that night, casting everything in this silvery light that made the broken windows look like black teeth. As we squeezed through a gap in the fence, I remember noticing how quiet it was. No cars, no animals, not even wind. Just our footsteps crunching on broken glass and gravel. The loading dock doors were exactly where Connor said they'd be, one of them hanging off its track at an angle that left just enough space for us to slip inside. Inside, our flashlights cut through the darkness to reveal exactly what Connor had promised. A massive production floor frozen in 2008. Half-assembled car frames sat on conveyor tracks, their metal bones covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. Tools lay scattered on workbenches like the workers had just stepped out for lunch and never came back. The air tasted metallic and stale, with this underlying smell of rust and decay that made Melissa pull her shirt up over her nose. Jake kept whistling low, running his hands along the equipment and muttering about how much some of this stuff would be worth if we could haul it out. But what struck me most was the sound. Every footstep echoed 3 or 4 times, bouncing off the high ceiling and coming back distorted. Connor was already heading toward a metal staircase that led up to the catwalks, his phone out, recording everything for his Instagram. The catwalks were where things started to go wrong. They ran 30 feet above the production floor, a maze of metal walkways that connected different sections of the factory. The railings were chest-high and sturdy enough, but the floor panels were a different story. Some were solid steel grating that clanged under our feet. Others were completely missing, leaving gaps you had to jump across. Worse, in the darkness, you couldn't always tell which was which until your flashlight caught the edge of a hole. Connor led the way, moving fast and confident like he'd done this 100 times before. Jake followed, then Melissa, then me bringing up the rear. We were heading toward what Connor said was the old executive office area, supposedly untouched with vintage computers and everything still on the desks. About halfway across, where 2 catwalks intersected, Connor stopped so suddenly that Jake almost ran into him. There was a section ahead where 3 floor panels in a row were missing, creating a gap about 8 feet long. "We can go around," Melissa said, her voice tight with fear. But Connor was already studying the gap, shining his light on the beams underneath. The support structure was still there, 2 parallel I-beams about a foot apart that ran under where the panels used to be. Connor stepped out onto the first beam, arms out for balance, his sneakers gripping the rusty metal. He made it look easy, placing one foot in front of the other like he was walking on a sidewalk. Jake went next, taking it slower but steady, and then helped Melissa across from the other side. When it was my turn, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The beam was maybe 6 inches wide, covered in rust and bird crap, and through the gap between them I could see straight down to the concrete floor. Old machinery and debris waited below like teeth. I made it halfway when my foot slipped on something wet, probably pigeon droppings, and for a second I thought I was going over. My arms windmilled wildly, and I managed to catch myself, but in that moment of panic my flashlight went flying. It tumbled end over end through the darkness before shattering on the floor below. The others helped me across the rest of the way, and Jake gave me his backup flashlight, one of those tiny LED things that barely pushed back the darkness. We kept going, but I was rattled, my legs shaking with leftover adrenaline. The catwalk continued for another 50 feet before reaching a door marked Administrative Wing in faded letters. Connor tried the handle, locked of course, but the wood around the deadbolt was rotted and soft. One solid kick from Jake and the whole thing splintered inward, revealing a hallway lined with offices. This part of the factory was different, carpeted and finished like a normal building, though everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and mold. We explored the offices, finding exactly what Connor had promised. Old computers, papers dated from 2008, coffee cups with dried rings at the bottom. In one executive office, there was a calendar still turned to November 2008, appointments written in blue pen that would never be kept. Jake found a desk drawer full of promotional materials for a car model that never made it to production, glossy brochures for a future that never came. We spent maybe 20 minutes in the offices taking photos and joking around, the earlier tension starting to fade. Connor found an old bottle of scotch in a filing cabinet and took a swig, grimacing at the taste but passing it around anyway. That's when Jake noticed another door at the end of the hallway, this one metal with a small window. Through the dusty glass, we could see it opened onto another section of catwalks, these ones crossing over what looked like the main assembly area. Connor was already pushing through, eager to explore more, and we followed like idiots. These catwalks were worse than the first ones, narrower, with more missing panels, and the railings were loose in places, wobbling when you touched them. The drop here was even higher, maybe 40 feet, and below us massive pieces of machinery lurked in the shadows like sleeping monsters. We were moving single file, Connor in front, when we reached a junction where 3 walkways met. The intersection was wider, maybe 10 feet across, but the center panel was gone, leaving just the metal frame around the edges. Connor was already planning his route across the frame when Jake grabbed his shoulder. "Hold up, man. Let me test it first." Jake was the biggest of us, built solid from years of manual labor, and if it could hold him, it could hold anyone. He stepped onto the frame, one foot then the other, arms out for balance. The metal groaned, but held. He was almost across when we heard it, a deep metallic crack like a gunshot. The frame didn't break, but one of the bolts holding it to the catwalk had sheared off, and the whole section tilted. Jake lunged forward, trying to reach the other side, but his foot went through the gap. His leg disappeared up to the thigh, his body slamming down hard on the metal edge, and then he was sliding backward. His hands scrabbled for purchase on the smooth metal, fingernails scraping, and then found the edge of a beam. He caught himself with both hands, his body dangling through the hole, legs kicking in empty air 40 feet above the factory floor. The jagged metal had torn through his jeans and into his thigh on the way down. I could see blood, black in the dim light, running down his leg and dripping into the darkness below. Melissa screamed, the sound echoing through the factory like an alarm. Connor and I dropped to our stomachs, reaching through the hole trying to grab Jake's wrists. His face was twisted in pain and terror, teeth gritted, arms already shaking from the strain. The metal edge was cutting into his palms. I could see the blood making his grip slippery. "Pull me up," he gasped, his voice high and desperate. Connor had one wrist, I had the other, and we pulled with everything we had. But Jake weighed at least 200 pounds, and the angle was all wrong. We managed to lift him maybe 6 inches before our own grip started failing. Melissa was on her phone, trying to call 911, but there was no signal this deep in the building. That's when we heard them. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing from somewhere below. Not the light, careful steps of urban explorers, but the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Jake heard them too, his eyes going wide. "Someone's down there," he whispered, as if being quiet would help, as if whoever it was hadn't already heard Melissa's scream. The footsteps got closer, and then we saw the light, a powerful beam sweeping across the factory floor below, much brighter than our pathetic flashlights. It swept back and forth methodically, like whoever was carrying it was searching for something. Or someone. The beam paused on the drops of Jake's blood hitting the concrete, then traced upward slowly, deliberately, until it hit Jake's dangling form. We were blinded for a second, white light flooding our vision, and then the light moved up to find our faces peering through the hole. I couldn't see who was holding it, just a dark silhouette behind that blazing beam. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever, just the sound of Jake's labored breathing and the distant drip of his blood. Then the figure below started walking again. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with that same measured pace. The footsteps echoed off in a different direction, and we heard a door slam somewhere in the darkness. "He's coming up," Connor said, his voice barely a whisper. "He knows the layout, he's coming up to us." That snapped us into action. Connor and I pulled harder, Melissa grabbing Jake under his armpits, all three of us straining against his weight. Jake was grunting with pain, his torn hands slipping, leaving bloody smears on the metal. We could hear doors slamming now, getting closer, echoing through the administrative wing we'd just explored. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. With one final, desperate heave, we got Jake's chest up to the edge. He threw one leg over, rolled onto the catwalk, and lay there gasping, blood pooling beneath his torn thigh. We didn't have time to check how bad it was. Connor was already pulling him to his feet, throwing Jake's arm over his shoulder. We ran, or tried to. Jake could barely put weight on his injured leg, hopping and stumbling, leaving a trail of blood behind us. We could hear the footsteps on the metal catwalks now, moving fast, knowing exactly which paths to take, which panels to avoid. We retraced our route, Jake crying out every time his foot hit the ground, Melissa supporting his other side. When we reached the gap with the I-beams, the 8-foot stretch that had seemed manageable before, we knew we were trapped. Jake couldn't make it across, not with his leg torn up, not with his hands bloody and weak. Behind us, the footsteps had stopped. We turned around, and there he was, a man in his 60s wearing a security uniform that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His face was weathered and deeply lined, with pale blue eyes that didn't blink enough. He was holding a police-style flashlight, the heavy metal kind that doubles as a weapon. "You kids need to leave," he said, his voice raspy like he didn't use it much. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Connor started to explain about Jake being hurt, but the man cut him off. "I don't care. You leave now or I call the real cops. Your friend bleeds out up here, that's on you." He stepped aside, pointing his light at the beam crossing. "Go on. Same way you came." We didn't have a choice. Connor went first, then came back to help Jake. Together we basically carried him across, his feet barely touching the beams, all of us certain we were going to fall. Melissa went next, crying, and then me. The man watched us the whole time, never offering to help, never moving from his spot. When we finally made it to the other side, he called out, "I see you here again. We're going to have a different kind of conversation. This place ain't for you." The key to St. Augustine's felt heavier than it should have in my pocket as I walked across the overgrown parking lot that Tuesday afternoon. Architecture students don't usually get to explore abandoned buildings alone for their thesis projects, but the County Historical Society had actually approved my request to document this Gothic revival church that had been shuttered since 2006. While everyone else in my program was obsessing over glass facades and sustainable materials, I'd chosen to focus on historical preservation for my final year. The building stood there against the gray sky, all weathered limestone and broken promises, about 40 minutes outside the city in this forgotten part of the county. I'd brought my measuring tape, my Nikon, 2 notebooks, and enough enthusiasm to fill the empty sanctuary. The massive oak doors groaned when I unlocked them, and that sound echoed across the empty lot like the building itself was waking up after 15 years of sleeping. Inside, the main sanctuary stole my breath in a way no modern building ever could. Colored light filtered through stained glass windows that had somehow survived decades of neglect, painting geometric patterns across rows of dust-covered pews. The carved columns reached up toward a vaulted ceiling that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, creating this oppressive quiet that made me hyper-aware of my own breathing. I spent the first 2 hours documenting everything upstairs: the altar's intricate woodwork, the stone baptismal font, the choir loft with its ancient organ pipes. Every surface had this thick coating of dust that kicked up with the slightest movement, making me sneeze and leaving strange patterns in the air. The Historical Society's notes mentioned original foundation stones from the 1890s in the basement level, architectural details that would be perfect for my research on 19th century church construction. Around 3 o'clock, I headed toward the narrow door marked lower-level access near the back of the sanctuary. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight in a way that made me grip the railing harder than necessary. There was no electricity down there, but I'd brought a decent flashlight knowing the basement would be dark. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing stone walls that wept moisture and a ceiling so low I had to duck in places even though I'm only 5'6". The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees as I descended, and this damp, heavy air wrapped around me like a wet blanket. About halfway down, I noticed the smell, just a hint at first. Something sweet and wrong mixed with the expected mustiness. I figured maybe a family of raccoons had gotten in and died somewhere in the walls. It happens in old buildings all the time. The basement itself was larger than I expected, divided into several rooms that probably served as storage and Sunday school classrooms back when the church was active. My flashlight beam swept across old folding tables, stacks of moldy hymnals, and children's drawings still tacked to a bulletin board. Their crayon colors faded to ghosts of purple and yellow. The smell got stronger as I moved deeper into the basement, documenting the stone foundation with my camera. It was this thick, cloying sweetness that stuck to the inside of my nose and made me breathe through my mouth. I found myself rushing through my measurements, not taking as many photos as I should have, just wanting to get the basic documentation done. In the furthest room, the one that must have been directly under the altar, the smell was so intense I had to pull my shirt up over my nose. There was this old wooden door in the back corner, probably leading to some kind of maintenance room or old coal cellar. The door was slightly ajar, maybe 3 inches open, and I could tell that's where the smell was coming from. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, flashlight beam trained on that gap, trying to convince myself to go check it out. But something in my gut, this primal instinct I couldn't explain, kept me frozen in place. The air coming from that room felt different, heavier somehow, and I had this sudden, irrational certainty that I needed to leave immediately. I practically ran back through the basement, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the stone walls. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I was doing, telling myself I'd gotten enough photos, that the smell was making me nauseous, that I could always come back another day with someone else. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I was terrified, and I didn't even understand why. The stairs seemed to go on forever as I climbed back up, and when I finally burst through into the sanctuary, I actually gasped at the regular air like I'd been holding my breath. The late afternoon sun streaming through those stained glass windows had never looked so welcoming. I grabbed my equipment bag from the front pew where I'd left it, shoved my camera and notebooks inside without organizing anything, and headed straight for the doors. My professor would probably dock points for incomplete documentation, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of that place. The drive home was strange because the further I got from the church, the more ridiculous I felt about my reaction. By the time I reached my apartment near campus, I'd almost convinced myself I was being dramatic, maybe getting my period or something, and that's why I'd overreacted to a bad smell in an old basement. I took a long shower, ordered Chinese food, and spent the evening organizing the photos I'd managed to take. The building really was architecturally significant. Those foundation stones were definitely from the original 1890s construction, and the sanctuary had details you just don't see anymore. I made notes about going back the following week, maybe bringing my friend Bethany, who was also into old buildings. That night I slept fine, didn't even dream about the place, and Wednesday passed without me thinking about it much at all, except to email the Historical Society, thanking them for the access and mentioning I'd return the key soon. Thursday morning changed everything. I was in the campus coffee shop around 9, scrolling through my phone while waiting for my latte, when the local news alert popped up. Human remains discovered in abandoned church, police investigation underway. My heart started hammering before my brain even processed what I was reading. The article was brief but specific. Maintenance workers preparing St. Augustine's Catholic Church for potential demolition had discovered badly decomposed human remains in a basement storage area. The body, which authorities believed had been there for several weeks, was found in what the article described as a concealed maintenance room. They'd posted a photo of the church's exterior with yellow police tape across those same oak doors I'd unlocked just 2 days earlier. I stood there in the coffee shop, phone trembling in my hand, while other students grabbed their drinks and chatted about normal things like upcoming exams and weekend plans. I threw up in the coffee shop bathroom. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly emptied my stomach while sitting on the floor of the handicapped stall, thinking about that wooden door in the basement's furthest room. 3 inches. It had been open 3 inches, and all that had stopped me from pushing it wider was some instinctive revulsion I couldn't even name. The article said the body had been there for weeks, which meant when I was down there taking photos, measuring stones, breathing through my shirt because of the smell, someone's son or daughter or parent was decomposing maybe 20 feet away from me. The maintenance workers had apparently opened that door looking for the source of what they called an unbearable odor. The same smell I'd tried to convince myself was just dead raccoons. I sat on that bathroom floor for probably 20 minutes, replaying every second I'd spent in that basement, wondering if the person had still been alive when the church was locked up, if they'd died trying to get out, if they'd screamed for help in a building designed to swallow sound. The police called me that afternoon. Apparently, the Historical Society had given them a list of everyone who'd had access to the church recently, and I was the last person who'd signed out the key. The detective, a woman named Hawkins with a voice that sounded tired, asked me to come to the station to answer some questions. I drove there in this weird state of numbness, part of me still hoping maybe they'd found old remains, something from decades ago that had nothing to do with my visit. But Detective Hawkins crushed that hope pretty quickly. The body was a man named Gregory Vance, 63 years old, reported missing 3 weeks earlier by his daughter. He'd been living on the streets for about a year after losing his job and his home, and his daughter said he sometimes sought shelter in abandoned buildings. The detective showed me his photo, a regular-looking guy with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt in what looked like a family barbecue photo. He'd probably gone into the church looking for a safe place to sleep and somehow gotten trapped in that maintenance room. Detective Hawkins kept asking if I'd noticed anything unusual, if I'd seen any signs of forced entry, if I'd explored the entire basement. I told her about the smell, about approaching that door, about leaving without checking further. She nodded and wrote things down, but I could see something in her expression, not judgment exactly, but maybe disappointment. If I'd pushed that door open on Tuesday, if I'd called 911 about finding Gregory Vance's body, his daughter could have started grieving 2 days sooner instead of wondering where her father was. The detective said the maintenance room's door had a broken lock mechanism that sometimes jammed from the inside. Gregory had probably pulled it shut for privacy and then couldn't get it open again. The basement had no windows, no other exit, and with the church abandoned, no one to hear him calling for help. She estimated he'd been dead for about 2 weeks when I was there based on decomposition. 2 weeks of him lying in the dark while his daughter put up missing person flyers and checked hospitals and hoped he was just staying with someone she didn't know. I left the police station around 5:30 and drove straight to my parents' house instead of my apartment. I needed to be somewhere that felt completely separate from all of this. Somewhere with normal sounds and cooking smells and my mom asking about school. But I couldn't eat dinner, couldn't focus on their questions about my thesis, couldn't stop thinking about Gregory Vance slowly dying of dehydration or hypothermia or panic in that locked room. My dad, who's always been good at reading me, finally asked what was really wrong, and I told them everything. My mom held me while I cried. Not the pretty kind of crying, but the ugly, snotty kind that comes from realizing you were inches away from something horrible and didn't know it. She kept saying it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known, that I did nothing wrong by leaving. But I've seen enough true crime shows to know that bodies discovered quickly mean more evidence, faster identification, answers for families. Those 2 extra days of decomposition, of evidence degrading, of his daughter not knowing, that was because I'd been too scared to push open a door. I never went back to get the photos off my camera's memory card for my thesis project, changed my topic to a modern community center being built downtown, something clean and new with good lighting and no basements. The Historical Society understood when I mailed back the key with a note saying I couldn't continue the documentation. Gregory Vance's obituary ran in the paper a week later. He'd been a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing plant for 30 years, had 3 grandchildren, loved fishing. His daughter organized a proper funeral with the money raised through GoFundMe, and even though I didn't know him, I went. Sat in the back row of a different church, one with electric lights and working heat, listening to people share memories of a man who died alone in the dark because a door lock failed. It's been 4 months now, and I still can't walk past abandoned buildings without wondering who might be inside, what door might be jammed, what smell might be drifting up from some forgotten room. My roommate thinks I'm being dramatic when I insist on checking every door in our apartment each night, making sure none can lock from inside. But she wasn't there in that basement, didn't stand 3 inches from death and choose to walk away. Summer of 2016, I was 17, and dumb enough to think crawling through storm drains was a good way to kill time. Living in a suburb outside Denver meant you had to get creative with your entertainment, and my friends Brandon and Nate were always down for whatever stupid idea we came up with. My parents both pulled 12-hour shifts at the hospital, which left me with way too much freedom and a house that stayed empty most days. Brandon had just inherited this rust-bucket Ford Ranger from his uncle, and having wheels made us feel invincible, like we could go anywhere and do anything without consequences. We'd been out of school for maybe 2 weeks when the boredom really started to hit. That Thursday in June started with us sitting in Nate's garage, passing around a bag of chips and scrolling through our phones, when Brandon brought up something his older brother had mentioned about these abandoned storm drains near the old rail yard. According to him, kids had been sneaking down there for years to party, tag the walls, basically do all the stuff you couldn't do topside without someone calling the cops. The rail yard sat on the east edge of town, past the industrial district where all the warehouses looked like they'd been empty since the 90s. We parked behind this collapsed loading dock and walked through knee-high weeds until we found the entrance, this massive concrete tube, maybe 8 feet across, partially hidden by a tangle of dead oak branches and garbage that had washed down from the street. The smell hit you first, like wet metal mixed with something organic that had been rotting for weeks. Brandon pulled out these heavy-duty flashlights he'd grabbed from his dad's workshop, the kind security guards carry that weigh about 5 pounds each. The opening was covered in layers of graffiti, fresh bubble letters sprayed over older tags, which were sprayed over even older stuff that looked like it had been carved into the concrete itself. A thin stream of brown water ran down the center, disappearing into the darkness where our flashlight beams couldn't reach. Nate kept cracking nervous jokes about contracting some disease or stumbling across a meth lab, but we all knew we were going in anyway. That's just how things worked with us. Nobody wanted to be the one who backed out first. We ducked into the tunnel single file, Brandon leading the way with his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. The concrete walls curved overhead, streaked with mineral deposits that looked like frozen waterfalls in the beam of light. Our footsteps echoed in this weird rhythmic pattern that bounced back at us from deeper in the system, making it sound like there were 6 of us walking instead of 3. About 50 feet in, we hit the first junction where the main tunnel split into 2 smaller passages. The left one angled down sharply, and you could hear water rushing somewhere below. The right stayed level but narrowed considerably, forcing you to hunch over if you were taller than 5'8". Brandon chose right without asking, probably because the left looked like a great way to slip and crack your skull open. The graffiti here was older, less artistic, mostly just names and dates going back to the 80s, some phone numbers that probably didn't exist anymore, and these weird symbols that looked almost like hobo code or something. The temperature kept dropping the further we went, and our breath started coming out in little clouds, even though it was probably 90 degrees outside. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, the tunnel opened up into this larger chamber where several pipes met. That's when we saw it in the corner, lit by 3 candles that were still burning. Someone had set up what looked like a whole living space. There was a sleeping bag laid out on a foam mattress, plastic milk crates stacked up like furniture, and trash bags full of what looked like clothes or blankets. Empty food cans were arranged in neat rows against the wall, labels all facing the same direction. A battery-powered radio sat on one of the crates, turned off but with a fresh pack of batteries sitting next to it still in the packaging. The candles threw these crazy shadows on the walls that made everything look like it was moving. But the thing that really got me was this notebook sitting open on top of the sleeping bag, with a pen placed carefully across the page like someone had just stopped writing mid-sentence. The whole setup was too organized, too deliberate. This wasn't some random homeless camp. This was someone's actual home. And from the looks of those burning candles, they couldn't have been gone for more than an hour or 2. Nate reached for the notebook, but Brandon grabbed his wrist before he could touch it. We all just stood there, flashlights dancing over this stranger's makeshift home, trying to process what we were looking at. The walls around the sleeping area were covered in newspaper clippings, all held up with duct tape and arranged in these perfect rows. Most of the articles were about missing pets from the neighborhood, going back months. There had to be at least 40 of them. Cats, dogs, even someone's rabbit. Each article had notes written in the margins with the same blue ballpoint pen, things like "found on elm," or "collar removed," or just dates with question marks. One of the milk crates had a collection of pet collars, maybe 15 or 20 of them, all different colors and sizes, some with tags still attached. I remember Brandon whispering that we needed to leave right now, but before anyone could move, we heard it. Footsteps splashing through water, coming from the left tunnel we'd passed earlier. Not running, just walking at this steady, measured pace. Like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going and had all the time in the world to get there. The footsteps stopped just outside the chamber entrance, and for maybe 3 seconds, everything went completely silent except for the sound of those candles flickering. Then a shape filled the tunnel opening. Tall, wearing what looked like a maintenance worker's coveralls that were way too big, dragging at the bottom. The person's face stayed in shadow, but I could see their hands clearly in our flashlight beams. The fingernails were long, curved, and caked with something dark underneath. They were holding what looked like a cloth sack in one hand, and it was moving, squirming like something alive was inside. Nobody said anything. The person tilted their head at this unnatural angle, like they were trying to see us better or maybe listening to something we couldn't hear. Then they took one step forward into the chamber, and their face caught the candlelight. Hollow cheeks, eyes that looked almost yellow in the dim light, and this perfectly calm expression like finding 3 teenagers in their secret underground home was the most normal thing in the world. They set the sack down carefully, never taking their eyes off us, and that's when we heard the muffled whimpering coming from inside it. Brandon was the first to break. He turned and bolted back the way we came, his flashlight beam swinging wildly across the walls. Nate and I didn't need any more encouragement. We ran after him, our feet slipping on the wet concrete as we scrambled through the narrow tunnel. Behind us, I could hear the person moving, not running but walking with these long, deliberate strides that somehow seemed to keep pace with our panicked sprint. Their breathing echoed through the pipes, this raspy wheeze that bounced off the walls and made it sound like they were right behind us, even when they weren't. At the junction, Brandon went straight instead of turning left toward the exit, and we had no choice but to follow him deeper into the system. The tunnel here was older, rougher, with chunks of concrete missing from the ceiling and rust-colored water dripping steadily from exposed rebar. Our flashlights started cutting out intermittently, probably from all the shaking as we ran, leaving us in complete darkness for seconds at a time. During one of those blackouts, I slammed face first into a low-hanging pipe, splitting my lip open and filling my mouth with the taste of blood and rust. We hit a dead end, a metal grate blocking the tunnel completely, too small to squeeze through and too strong to break. Brandon was pulling at it desperately, his fingers already bleeding from the sharp edges, while Nate kept looking back the way we came, holding his flashlight with both hands to keep it steady. The footsteps had stopped, but we could still hear that breathing, getting closer but taking its time. Then the person started talking, not yelling or threatening, just speaking in this conversational tone like we were having coffee together. They were listing names: Whiskers, Buddy, Princess, Max, and after each name they'd make this clicking sound with their tongue. The sack they'd been carrying earlier must have still been with them, because we could hear scratching and whimpering between the names. They kept talking about how the animals trusted them, how easy it was to make friends with something hungry, how they'd been collecting for months and nobody ever came looking in the tunnels. The voice was getting closer, maybe 30 feet away now, and our flashlights were getting dimmer as the batteries died. Nate started crying, just standing there shaking and crying, while Brandon kept pulling at that grate like a trapped animal. The person emerged from the darkness just as Brandon's flashlight died completely. In Nate's weakening beam, we could see them clearly now, probably in their 40s, with patchy gray hair that hung in greasy strands past their shoulders. They were smiling, showing teeth that were surprisingly white and straight, which somehow made everything worse. They set the moving sack down gently and pulled out what looked like a leash from their pocket, one of those retractable ones that made a zipping sound as they played with the mechanism. "You three remind me of Cooper," they said, pointing at a golden retriever collar hanging from their belt. Cooper was curious too, came right up to me behind the grocery store, such a good boy. They took another step closer, and I could smell them now, like wet dog mixed with something chemical, maybe bleach or ammonia. Nate had backed himself into the corner where the wall met the grate, making these small whimpering sounds that sounded too much like whatever was in that sack. The person noticed and laughed, this normal, genuine laugh, like someone had told them a funny joke at work. That's when Brandon snapped. He grabbed his dead flashlight and threw it as hard as he could, hitting the person square in the forehead. They stumbled backward, more surprised than hurt, and Brandon screamed at us to run. We shoved past the person while they were still off balance, Nate dropping his flashlight in the process, leaving us in total darkness. But Brandon remembered the way, left at the junction, then straight, following the sound of dripping water and the faint smell of outside air. Behind us, the person wasn't running, just walking and calling out pet names like they were trying to coax us back. "Here, kitty kitty, come on boy, that's a good girl." We could see a pinpoint of light ahead, real sunlight, and we ran toward it like our lives depended on it, which honestly, they probably did. The concrete scraped our hands and knees as we scrambled up the slight incline toward the exit. I could hear sirens in the distance. Turned out someone had seen Brandon's truck parked by the abandoned rail yard and called it in as suspicious activity. We burst out of that tunnel into the blazing afternoon sun, all three of us crying and bleeding and probably looking absolutely insane to the two cops who were just getting out of their patrol car. We tried to explain everything to the cops, the living space in the tunnels, the missing pet articles, the person with the sack, but we were so hysterical that nothing came out right. One officer stayed with us while the other went to check the tunnel entrance, but he only went about 20 feet in before coming back out, saying it was too dangerous without proper equipment and backup. They called it in, and within an hour there were fire trucks, animal control, and even a news van setting up in the rail yard. The fire department sent a team down with proper lights and safety gear, but they found nothing. No sleeping bag, no milk crates, no newspaper clippings, and definitely no person in maintenance coveralls. Even the notebook was gone. The only thing they found was a single pet collar caught on a piece of rebar about 50 yards in, a red one with a heart-shaped tag that said Bailey. The cops took our statements, called our parents, and basically told us we were lucky we only got scared. They suggested maybe we'd stumbled onto a homeless camp and our imaginations had run wild in the dark. Brandon's dad grounded him for the rest of the summer. Nate's parents made him start seeing a therapist, and my folks installed a tracking app on my phone that I couldn't delete until I turned 18. The story should have ended there. Just 3 stupid kids who scared themselves in a drainage tunnel. But 2 weeks later, I was walking home from my job at the grocery store when I saw them. The person from the tunnel, standing at the bus stop across from my house, wearing normal clothes this time, just jeans and a polo shirt. They were reading a newspaper, acting like any other person waiting for the bus. When they looked up and saw me, they smiled and waved, then held up the newspaper so I could see the headline, "Another missing pet story," this time a tabby cat named Oliver from our neighborhood. They folded the paper carefully, tucked it under their arm, and got on the bus when it arrived, never breaking eye contact until the doors closed. I never saw them again after that, but for the next year until we graduated and I left for college, missing pet posters kept appearing around town. The police never found anything. The tunnels got sealed with concrete barriers after our incident, and everyone seemed to forget about it, except for Brandon, Nate, and me. We never talked about it, not even with each other. But sometimes I'd catch one of them staring at missing pet posters a little too long, and I knew they were thinking the same thing I was. Somewhere in town, that person was still collecting, still making friends with hungry animals, still living their deeply disturbed life in broad daylight, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it. I'd been sleeping in abandoned houses around Philadelphia for about 2 months when I found the Victorian on Allegheny Street. 23 years old, college dropout, working random gigs that barely covered food. That was me in early 2018. My car had been repossessed in January, and the shelter wait lists were impossible. So I learned to spot the signs of a good squat. Broken padlocks that nobody bothered to replace, overgrown yards that meant the city had given up, and most importantly, other people's stuff already inside. That meant it was either safe enough or at least you wouldn't be alone if things went bad. I met Sophia outside the library one afternoon while we were both using the Wi-Fi. She had these thick dreadlocks with purple tips and this gap between her front teeth that made her look younger than she probably was. She's the one who told me about the house, said 7 people were already crashing there, and they had actual electricity. When she mentioned it used to belong to some dealer named Rico, who'd been locked up since 2013. I should have thought twice, but sleeping somewhere with heat and other people around sounded better than another night in a freezing warehouse. The house stood out even on a street full of abandoned properties, 3 stories of rotting Victorian grandeur with faded green trim peeling off like dead skin. The porch slumped in the middle, held up by wooden pillars that looked ready to snap, and every window facing the street was boarded with plywood that had turned gray and soft from rain. Sophia showed me the side entrance where someone had pried off the board just enough to squeeze through, and she knocked this specific pattern 4 times, pause, then twice more. Inside, it was shockingly organized, like someone had tried to make it an actual home. Walter, this 60-something white guy with trembling hands from years of drinking, had rigged electricity from the streetlight outside and set up space heaters in 3 rooms. There was Janet and Paul, a black couple in their 40s who'd lost everything to medical debt, sleeping in what used to be the dining room. 2 kids couldn't have been older than 20, Destiny and Carlos, had claimed the smallest bedroom upstairs. The living room still had all of Rico's old furniture. This hideous gold velvet couch covered in cigarette burns, a glass coffee table with one corner completely shattered and held together with duct tape, and strangest of all, an empty fish tank that still had blue gravel, and a little deep-sea diver figure standing at the bottom, like someone just forgot to add water one day and never remembered. For 3 weeks we had this weird routine that almost felt normal. Walter would wake up at 5 every morning and make instant coffee on the hot plate, the smell drifting through the whole house. Janet worked part-time at a dollar store and would bring back expired food they couldn't sell. Dented cans of soup, stale bread, sometimes even frozen stuff that was still good. Paul spent his days at the library applying for jobs on the computer, always wearing this same navy suit that he kept impossibly clean despite everything. Destiny and Carlos would disappear during the day, coming back with random things they'd found or stolen. Toilet paper from restaurant bathrooms, half-eaten pizzas from dumpsters behind colleges, once even a whole rotisserie chicken still warm from Giant Eagle. We'd eat dinner together most nights, sitting on that ugly gold couch or on milk crates around the broken coffee table, sharing whatever we had. Sophia would tell these wild stories about hitchhiking across the country, how she'd lived in a commune in New Mexico where they grew their own food, how she'd worked on a fishing boat in Alaska for a summer, even in that decaying house that smelled like mold and old cigarettes, with police sirens going off every hour and trains rattling past on the nearby tracks. It felt safer than being alone. Everything changed on a Monday night in February. I remember because Janet had just gotten paid and brought back a bunch of canned chili, and we were actually having a good time, joking about opening a restaurant called Rock Bottom Cafe. Around 11, just as most of us were settling in for the night, we heard this car pull up outside. Not unusual, except the engine kept running. Then footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate, not trying to be quiet like cops would. We all went silent, that kind of stillness where you can hear everyone's breathing. The footsteps stopped right at the front door, which we never used because it was visible from the street. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then there was this sound I'll never forget. Metal scraping against wood, followed by this massive thunk that shook the whole door frame. The scraping sound came again, and another thunk, and we realized someone was driving something through the door from the outside. Walter grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the front hallway, while the rest of us huddled in the living room. When he came back, his face was completely white. He said there was a machete, not a knife, a fucking machete, sticking through the front door, buried so deep the blade came out the other side by about 6 inches. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever. We just stared at each other while that car engine kept rumbling outside. Then, as suddenly as it arrived, we heard the car door slam, and it drove off, tires squealing as it turned the corner. Carlos wanted to go look, maybe get a license plate, but Walter grabbed his arm and told him not to be stupid. Janet was whispering prayers under her breath while Paul held her, and Sophia had this look on her face like she'd seen this kind of thing before. Destiny started packing her stuff right then and there, shoving her clothes into a garbage bag, saying she wasn't staying another minute. But Walter convinced us to wait until morning. The streets were more dangerous at night, and whoever that was might still be watching. We pushed the couch and everything heavy we could find against the front door, then took turns staying awake in pairs, watching the windows. I was paired with Sophia for the 3 to 6 shift, and she told me this probably had to do with Rico's old business. Maybe someone thought there were still drugs or money hidden in the house. She said her ex-boyfriend used to deal, and leaving a weapon like that was a message, either to scare someone or mark territory. The machete stayed there all night, wobbling slightly whenever a truck passed by and shook the house. When the sun came up, we could finally see the full extent of what had happened. The machete was even bigger than we'd thought, probably 2 feet long with a black rubber handle wrapped in duct tape. It had gone through the solid wood door like it was cardboard, and there were fresh scratches on the door frame where someone had used it to pull themselves up, like they'd put their whole body weight behind driving it in. Paul wanted to call the cops, but everyone else shot that down immediately. We were trespassing, and half of us had warrants or records that would land us in jail. Walter said he knew some guys from his construction days who might buy the machete for scrap metal, but nobody wanted to touch it. Around noon, I decided I needed air and walked to the corner store for cigarettes. When I came back 20 minutes later, everyone was outside on the sidewalk with their stuff. The front door was wide open, the machete was gone, and Sophia grabbed my arm before I could go inside. She said about 5 minutes after I left, 3 men in ski masks had walked right in through the side entrance like they knew exactly where it was. They didn't say a word, just started going through every room, throwing mattresses, dumping out bags, even pulling up loose floorboards in the kitchen. Everyone ran out the front door. The men didn't try to stop them, didn't even look at them, just kept searching. We stood there on the sidewalk for maybe 10 minutes, everyone arguing about what to do. Janet wanted to leave right away. Paul kept saying we should wait and go back for our things. And Walter was convinced the men were looking for Rico's stash that probably didn't even exist anymore. Then we heard this crash from inside, like furniture being flipped, followed by what sounded like walls being hit with something heavy, probably a sledgehammer from the sound. That's when I noticed Carlos wasn't with us. Destiny started screaming his name, completely hysterical, saying he'd gone upstairs to grab his backpack right before the men showed up. Before anyone could stop her, she ran toward the house. Sophia and I grabbed her just as she reached the porch, and that's when we heard it. A man's voice from inside, low and calm, saying, "Where is it?" over and over. And another voice, younger, crying and saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." It was Carlos. The calm voice said something in Spanish I couldn't understand. Then there was this wet sound, like meat being tenderized, and Carlos screamed. Not like in movies. This was raw animal panic. Destiny was fighting us, trying to get inside, and Walter had to practically carry her across the street while she sobbed and cursed at us for not letting her go. The sounds from inside continued for maybe 5 more minutes. Furniture breaking, that calm voice asking questions, Carlos responding but his voice getting weaker. Then everything went quiet. We watched from across the street as the 3 men walked out the front door like they had all the time in the world. 2 of them were carrying black duffel bags that looked heavy, and the third one, the biggest, had blood on his jacket sleeve. They didn't run, didn't even look at us standing right there in plain sight. They got into a black SUV with tinted windows that had been parked around the corner and drove away at normal speed, even stopping at the stop sign. Destiny broke free and ran into the house before any of us could react. We heard her scream from upstairs, this horrible, broken sound that just kept going. When Sophia and I went in after her, the place was destroyed. Every piece of furniture flipped or smashed, holes punched in the walls. Even the ceiling tiles in the kitchen had been pulled down. We found Destiny in the small bedroom, kneeling next to Carlos. He was conscious but barely, curled up in a ball, his face swollen beyond recognition, blood pooling on the floor from a gash on his scalp. His left arm was bent at an angle that made me want to throw up, and he kept making these small, whimpering sounds like a hurt dog. Paul called 911 from a payphone down the street, while the rest of us tried to help Carlos. Sophia knew some basic first aid from her time in that commune, and used torn sheets to put pressure on his head wound. Carlos kept trying to talk through his swollen lips, saying something about how they kept asking about the package, and wouldn't believe him when he said he didn't know anything. Walter found the duffel bags the men had been carrying. Turns out they'd been hidden inside the walls, behind some loose panels in the basement none of us had ever noticed. There were still traces of white powder in the corners of the bags and rubber band marks on the floor where money bundles had probably been. Rico's stash had been there the whole time, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of drugs and cash, just sitting behind the walls while we slept 20 feet away. The ambulance arrived in about 15 minutes, and the EMTs didn't ask questions. They'd seen this kind of thing before. As they loaded Carlos onto the stretcher, one of them quietly told Destiny that if we were smart, we'd be gone before the cops showed up to investigate. The neighbors had started coming out of their houses, and I heard one old woman telling another that she knew something like this would happen, that Rico's cousins had been coming around asking questions for weeks. We scattered within the hour. Janet and Paul went to stay with her sister in Jersey. Walter said he knew a guy with a warehouse where he could crash, and Destiny went with Carlos in the ambulance, refusing to leave his side. That left me and Sophia standing on the sidewalk with our garbage bags of belongings, trying to figure out our next move. She had a friend in Fishtown who might let us stay for a few nights, but we needed to get across the city and neither of us had money for the bus. As we started walking, I made the mistake of looking back at the house one more time. There was already a new padlock on the side entrance, and I swear I saw someone watching us from the third-floor window. Just a shadow that moved away when I looked directly at it. Sophia saw it too and grabbed my hand, pulling me along faster. We walked for 2 hours straight, not stopping until we reached the bridge over the Delaware. She finally broke the silence, saying that in all her years on the streets, she'd never been that close to dying. Those men hadn't cared who was in the house. If they'd thought any of us knew where their money was, we'd all have ended up like Carlos or worse. The scary part was how professional they were, how they knew exactly where to look, like someone had told them precisely where Rico had hidden everything. 3 days later, I was staying at a women's shelter in South Philly when I saw the news on TV. They'd found 2 bodies in a house on Allegheny Street. Not our house, but one just 3 doors down. The reporters said it was drug-related, that the victims were known associates of a dealer who'd been imprisoned years ago. They showed a picture of the victims, and my heart stopped. It was 2 guys I'd never seen before, but Sophia later told me she recognized them from the neighborhood. They used to hang around our house sometimes, asking Walter if anyone had been inside lately, if we'd found anything interesting. Turns out they were Rico's cousins, the ones the old lady had mentioned, and they'd probably been killed by the same men who tortured Carlos. The news said they'd been dead for at least a week, which meant they were murdered before the machete incident, before the men came searching. Those cousins had probably been tortured for the location of Rico's stash, gave up the information, and then were killed anyway. We'd been living in that house the entire time, completely oblivious to the fact that we were sitting on top of a fortune that people were willing to kill for. If those men had come just a few days earlier, or if we'd found those hidden panels ourselves, we'd probably be dead too. I ran into Sophia one more time, about a month later at a food bank in Center City. She told me Carlos survived, but lost partial use of his left arm, and he and Destiny had left Philadelphia entirely, maybe headed to Florida where her family lived. Walter had gotten into a program and was trying to get sober. Janet and Paul were still at her sister's place trying to save up for their own apartment. As for the house, Sophia said she'd walked by it the previous week out of curiosity. It had been completely gutted. Windows removed, doors taken off, even parts of the walls had been torn down. The city had put up official condemned notices and metal barriers over every entrance. But the really unsettling part was what she'd heard from other people still living on the streets in that area. They said that sometimes at night cars would still pull up to the house, people would get out and walk around it, like they were checking to make sure it stayed empty. Nobody squatted there anymore, even though winter was coming and desperate people needed shelter. The house had become a kind of urban legend among the homeless community, a cautionary tale about the dangers of sleeping in the wrong place. Looking back now, I realize how incredibly lucky we were. We'd spent 3 weeks living inside a ticking time bomb, surrounded by hidden drug money, with Rico's associates circling like vultures. The only reason we survived was pure chance. We were nobodies, not worth interrogating or killing, just obstacles to be pushed aside while they reclaimed what they thought was theirs. Photography has been my escape since college, and last April I finally had a free Saturday to explore the old Riverside paper mill, about 40 minutes outside of town. I was 28, teaching high school biology during the week, and spending weekends hunting for abandoned places to photograph. The mill had been shut down since the early 90s, and from what I'd researched online, it used to employ half the county before cheaper operations moved everything overseas. That morning, I packed my camera bag with extra batteries, grabbed a flashlight and some water, and drove out there alone. Something I usually avoided, but my regular exploring partner Jason was visiting family in Ohio. The building sat isolated behind overgrown chain-link fencing, its red brick walls covered in vines and graffiti, windows either boarded up or shattered into jagged teeth. Getting inside was easier than expected. Someone had already cut a person-sized hole in the fence near the loading dock, and one of the dock doors hung partially open, rusted off its tracks. The main floor stretched out like a cathedral of decay, with massive paper rolling machines standing silent under layers of dust and bird droppings. Shafts of light cut through gaps in the roof, creating these incredible contrast patterns that made my photographer's heart race with excitement. Spent the first hour just shooting the machinery, the peeling paint on the walls, and the way nature had started reclaiming the space through cracks in the concrete floor. The building had multiple levels connected by metal staircases, and I'd planned to work my way up systematically. But then I noticed a doorway at the back that led to what looked like an older section of the mill, probably from the original construction in the 1920s. The older section had a completely different feel. Narrower hallways, lower ceilings, and this oppressive dampness that made breathing uncomfortable. My footsteps echoed differently here, more muffled, like the walls were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. The dust was thicker too, undisturbed except for a clear path down the center where someone had walked recently, maybe other urban explorers, though I hadn't seen any fresh graffiti or beer cans like you usually find. I followed the hallway past several small offices, their doors hanging open to reveal overturned desks and scattered papers yellowed with age. At the end of the corridor, a set of wooden stairs descended into what must have been a storage basement, and even though every rational part of my brain said to stick to the upper floors where there was natural light, I couldn't resist the pull of documenting spaces that probably hadn't been photographed in decades. The basement was a maze of concrete pillars and low-hanging pipes, with old chemical drums stacked against the walls, and the acrid smell of decades-old industrial solvents making my eyes water. I had to use my flashlight constantly down there, sweeping it back and forth to avoid tripping over debris or hitting my head on the pipes. About 50 feet in, I found this amazing spot where a partial collapse in the ceiling had created a natural skylight effect, with a single beam of dusty light illuminating a section of floor like a stage. I set up my tripod carefully, adjusting the legs to account for the uneven ground, and was framing the shot when I noticed something that made me pause. There were drag marks in the dust, 2 parallel lines about shoulder width apart, leading from the darkness beyond the pillars toward a section of floor that had completely caved in, creating a jagged hole about 6 feet across. At first I thought maybe someone had dragged equipment or scrap metal to dump it down the hole, but the marks were too uniform, too deliberate, and they had this weird pattern to them like whoever made them had been struggling or stopping frequently. I abandoned my camera on the tripod and walked closer to the collapsed section, using my flashlight to peer down into the darkness below. The hole opened into what looked like a sub-basement, or maybe an old drainage tunnel, probably another 15 feet down, with chunks of concrete and twisted rebar jutting out at dangerous angles. The smell coming up from it was different from the chemical odor, earthier, more organic, with this underlying sweetness that reminded me of composting leaves but wrong somehow, corrupted. I was about to step back when my flashlight caught something pale tangled in the rebar about halfway down. The fabric was a light blue, maybe denim or cotton work clothes, torn and stained dark in places that could have been rust or mud, but had this brownish-red color that looked too deliberate, too concentrated. I lay flat on my stomach, ignoring the filth and broken glass, and stretched my arm down with the flashlight to get a better angle. That's when I saw more pieces of fabric caught on different sections of rebar, and beneath them, partially buried under chunks of fallen concrete, there were other things. What might have been a work boot with the sole separated from the leather, something that could have been a tool belt or bag strap, and worst of all, these dark stains on the concrete chunks that had pooled and dried in patterns that absolutely were not rust. My whole body went rigid as my brain processed what I was looking at, and I scrambled backwards so fast I knocked over a paint can, the metallic clang echoing through the basement like a gunshot. The echo hadn't even finished reverberating when I heard something else. Footsteps above me, deliberate and heavy, crossing the main factory floor. I grabbed my camera, fumbling with the tripod legs, trying to collapse them quickly while keeping my flashlight trained on the stairs I'd come down. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, and dust drifted down through the cracks between the floorboards, dancing in my flashlight beam like snow. Whoever was up there knew exactly where I was, and they weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. I could hear them moving toward the hallway that led to the basement stairs, their pace unhurried, confident, like they knew I had nowhere to go. My mind raced through options. The hole was a death trap. The basement had no other exits that I'd seen, and confronting whoever was coming down those stairs seemed like the worst possible choice. I killed my flashlight and moved as quietly as possible behind one of the concrete pillars, clutching my camera bag against my chest to stop the equipment from rattling. The darkness was absolute except for that single shaft of light from the ceiling collapse, and I watched it like my life depended on it, waiting to see a shadow pass through. The footsteps reached the top of the wooden stairs, and each creak of the old board sent jolts through my nervous system. They descended slowly, pausing every few steps like they were listening for me, and I held my breath until my lungs burned. When they reached the basement floor, I heard them walk directly to the collapsed section, their feet crunching on the broken glass and debris I'd disturbed. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. And then I heard something that made my insides turn to water, the sound of them dragging something heavy across the floor, something that scraped and caught on the rough concrete, heading straight toward the hole. The dragging stopped right at the edge of the collapse, and I heard a grunt of effort followed by the sickening sound of something heavy tumbling down into the hole, crashing against the rebar and concrete below. The person above muttered something I couldn't make out, their voice low and gravelly, definitely male, and then started kicking loose debris down after whatever they'd dropped. Each piece of concrete that fell made me flinch, knowing I'd been lying in that exact spot just minutes earlier, my face inches from evidence of what this place really was. Through a gap between the pipes, I could barely make out a silhouette in that shaft of light. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like coveralls and heavy work boots. He pulled something from his pocket, and I heard the distinctive click of a lighter, followed by the smell of cigarette smoke mixing with all the other toxic scents in the air. He stood there smoking for several minutes, occasionally nudging more debris into the hole with his boot, completely casual like this was routine maintenance work. I stayed frozen behind the pillar, my leg muscles cramping from holding the same position, terrified that any movement would give me away. The cigarette glowed orange in the darkness as he took long drags, and I could see him checking his watch in the lighter's flame when he lit a second one. Finally, he flicked the butt down the hole and started walking back toward the stairs. But then he stopped suddenly and turned his head like he was listening. I heard him walk to where I'd left my tripod. In my panic, I'd only grabbed the camera, leaving the expensive carbon fiber tripod standing there like a beacon. He picked it up, collapsed it with practiced efficiency, and carried it with him as he headed back to the stairs, his footsteps now quicker, more purposeful. I waited in that basement for another 2 hours after his footsteps faded completely, until my phone showed 4 p.m. and the shaft of light had shifted angles. Every tiny sound made me think he was coming back, that he was waiting for me upstairs, that he knew exactly where I was hiding. When I finally worked up the courage to move, my joints were so stiff I nearly fell over, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from crying out. I crept up the stairs one at a time, pausing at the top to listen for any sign of movement in the building. The main floor was empty, but I could see fresh boot prints in the dust leading to the loading dock where I'd entered. My car was still there, untouched, but there was a folded piece of paper under the windshield wiper. With shaking fingers, I unfolded it to find a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning, with a handwritten note on the back. Beautiful equipment. Would be a shame if something happened to it. Or to you. I drove straight to the police station in town, showed them the photos I'd managed to take before seeing the drag marks, and tried to explain what I'd found. 2 officers went out to investigate that evening, but they came back saying the basement floor had been completely filled with fresh concrete. Someone had dumped what must have been several trucks worth down there, sealing everything. They took my statement, said they'd look into it, but I could tell from their expressions they thought I was either lying or had imagined things. The officer in charge suggested that urban exploration was dangerous and illegal, that I was lucky nothing worse had happened. I never went back to check, never posted those photos online, and eventually deleted them entirely. I still have that hardware store receipt though. Keep it in a drawer as a reminder that some abandoned places should stay abandoned, that some secrets are buried for a reason, and that someone out there knows I know what that mill really is. A tomb disguised as ruins. The old Westfield Elementary had been sitting empty on Route 49 for almost 15 years when we decided to break in that Friday night in 2017. I was 17, stuck in small-town Indiana for the summer, counting down the days until I could escape to college. My parents ran the only hardware store in town, and I'd been working there since I was old enough to carry a paint can without dropping it. Most nights after closing, I'd meet up with the same group of friends behind the abandoned gas station on Miller Road. It was either that or drive 40 minutes to the nearest mall. That night there were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Tommy, who'd been my neighbor since 3rd grade, his girlfriend Ashley, who worked at the diner on Main Street, this new kid Kevin, who'd moved here from Chicago and wouldn't shut up about how much better the city was, and Kevin's cousin Daniela, who was visiting for a couple weeks and barely spoke to any of us. We were passing around a bag of gas station chips and arguing about whether the town's single movie theater would ever show anything besides kids' movies when Kevin brought up the school. He claimed his older brother had tried to get inside last year but got spooked when he saw shadows moving behind the boarded-up windows on the 2nd floor. Tommy laughed so hard he nearly choked on his energy drink, calling the brother every name in the book for being such a coward. Before I knew it, Tommy was standing up, crushing his empty can against the brick wall, and declaring that we were going to prove we weren't afraid of some burned-out elementary school. Ashley tried to act bored by the whole idea, but I could tell she didn't want to be the one to back down. Daniela just kept scrolling through her phone, barely looking up when she mumbled that she'd go if everyone else was going. Kevin looked like he regretted bringing it up, but his pride wouldn't let him back out now. Within 10 minutes, we were all piled into Tommy's ancient Corolla, the one with the passenger door that wouldn't open from the inside and a radio that only picked up the Christian station. The school was 20 minutes outside town, past the corn processing plant and down a stretch of road where the streetlights had stopped working years ago. We parked behind a cluster of dead trees about 100 yards from the building, figuring it was better to walk the rest of the way in case someone drove by and saw the car. The moment we got out, the summer heat gave way to this weird chill that comes with abandoned places, like the air itself knows nobody belongs there anymore. The school was a 2-story brick building, probably built in the 60s judging by those narrow windows and flat roof. Half of it was completely charred black from the fire Kevin mentioned, with the roof caved in on the east wing. The other half looked mostly intact from the outside, except every single window had been covered with plywood sheets, and someone had spray-painted "Keep Out" across the main entrance in red paint that had dripped down like blood in a horror movie. The chain-link fence surrounding the property had been cut open in at least 3 different spots, and we picked the widest gap to squeeze through. Tommy led the way with his phone flashlight, trying to act tough even though I noticed him hesitating every few steps. The main entrance was sealed tight, massive sheets of plywood nailed over the double doors with what must have been 100 nails, some of them bent and rusty like people had tried to pry them out before giving up. We circled around to the back of the building, our shoes crunching on broken glass and dead leaves that had accumulated over the years. Kevin pointed out a ground floor window on the intact side where the plywood had been partially pried away, leaving just enough space for someone to squeeze through if they didn't mind getting scraped up. The wood was splintered at the edges, and there were fresh scratches in the paint around the opening. Clearly, we weren't the first ones to find this entrance. Tommy went first, of course, grunting as he pulled himself through the gap. We heard him drop down inside with a thud and a string of curses before he called back that it was safe. Ashley went next, then me, then Kevin, and finally Daniela, who had to be convinced twice that she could fit through the opening. Inside, we found ourselves in what used to be a cafeteria kitchen. Stainless steel counters were still bolted to the walls, though they were covered in rust and graffiti. The floor was littered with old food trays, broken ceiling tiles, and puddles of water from leaks in the roof. The smell hit us immediately, mildew mixed with something chemical, probably from whatever cleaning supplies had been left behind to rot. Our phone lights created these crazy shadows that danced across the walls as we moved, making every corner look like something was hiding there. We made our way out of the kitchen and into the main cafeteria, where long tables were still arranged in rows, some flipped over, others still standing like students might walk in any minute for lunch. The walls were covered in layers of graffiti, tags from different years overlapping each other, dates going back to 2005, names of couples who probably broke up years ago. Tommy was already heading toward a set of double doors that led to the main hallway, acting like he owned the place. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with classroom doors, most of them hanging open at weird angles. Water damage had warped the wooden doors, and the drop ceiling had collapsed in several places, leaving tangles of wires and insulation hanging down like intestines. We picked the left side first, poking our heads into empty classrooms where desks were either missing or stacked against walls. Everything was exactly what you'd expect from a place abandoned for over a decade. Dust, decay, and the occasional piece of furniture too heavy for scavengers to steal. But then we reached the last classroom at the end of the hall, room 108, and everything changed. The door was closed but not locked, and when Tommy pushed it open, we all just stood there staring. The desks were arranged in perfect rows, 5 across and 6 deep, all facing the blackboard at the front. Not pushed around or flipped over like every other room, arranged like class was about to start. But the really disturbing part was the graffiti on the walls. While the rest of the building had layers upon layers of old tags, faded and overlapping, this room had fresh writing. I mean fresh. The black marker still had that chemical smell when you got close to it. The writing covered every inch of the walls from floor to about shoulder height, all in the same neat handwriting. Not gang tags or curse words like you'd expect, but weird phrases repeated over and over. They watch from the ceiling tiles, written maybe 50 times along one wall. Don't trust the janitor's closet, in perfect cursive along another. Class never ended for Rebecca, spelled out in block letters near the windows. Ashley grabbed my arm when she noticed the dates scattered throughout the writing. Some were from just a week ago, others from 3 days ago. The most recent one, near the door frame where we'd just entered, was from yesterday. Tommy tried to play it cool, saying someone was obviously just messing with people who broke in, but his voice cracked when he said it. Kevin walked over to one of the desks and opened it. Inside was a math textbook from 2002, the pages yellowed but otherwise perfect, and a pencil box with everything still neatly arranged inside. Daniela was the one who noticed the teacher's desk wasn't empty either. There was a grade book open on top, and when she got closer with her phone light, we could see names written in it. Recent names, not from when the school was open. First names only. Anthony, absent. Megan, present. Luis, present. Rebecca. And then nothing, just a dark ink stain where the pen had leaked onto the page. The dates at the top of each column went back about a month, with perfect attendance tracked for invisible students. Tommy grabbed the book and flipped through it, page after page of the same thing. Attendance records for a class that didn't exist, going back months. That's when we heard it for the first time. Footsteps directly above us, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. Not the random creaking of an old building, but the distinct rhythm of someone walking from one end of a room to the other. We all looked up at the ceiling, following the sound with our eyes as it moved across the room above us, stopped for a moment, then walked back. Kevin immediately pulled out his phone to record, whispering that we needed proof, or no one would believe us. The footsteps continued their pattern, 8 steps one way, pause, 8 steps back. Too consistent to be an animal, too heavy to be the wind moving something around. Tommy, trying to regain his tough guy status, announced he was going upstairs to check it out. Ashley told him he was insane, but he was already heading back to the hallway. The rest of us followed, not because we wanted to, but because splitting up seemed worse. The stairwell was at the center of the building, behind a heavy metal door that screamed when we pushed it open. Our phone lights barely penetrated the darkness inside, and the stairs were covered in debris, chunks of plaster, old papers, what looked like clothing bunched up in the corners. The footsteps above had stopped the moment we opened the stairwell door, which somehow made everything worse. We climbed slowly, Tommy first, then me, the girls in the middle, and Kevin bringing up the rear, still recording everything. Halfway up, Daniela grabbed Ashley's hand and whispered that we should leave, but Tommy was already at the top, pushing through another door into the second-floor hallway. The second floor was in worse shape than the first. The fire damage was more evident here. Black scorch marks crawled across the walls, and several doorways were completely blocked by collapsed ceiling beams. The smell of old smoke still lingered, mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something organic and wrong. We stood clustered together at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing, just our own breathing and the distant sound of wind through broken windows somewhere. Then Tommy's light caught something that made us all step back, fresh footprints in the dust, leading from the stairwell down the hall toward the intact classrooms. Not old prints, but clear, recent ones. The dust still settled in perfect shoe patterns. Adult-sized boots with a distinctive tread pattern, like work boots. The prints went both directions, overlapping in places like someone had been walking back and forth for a while. Ashley whispered that we should go back downstairs and just leave, but Tommy was already following the footprints, and somehow we all ended up following him, our lights creating a moving bubble of visibility in the darkness. The footprints led to a classroom door that was slightly ajar, room 204 according to the faded number plate. Tommy reached for the handle, and that's when the footsteps started again, but this time they were running. Heavy boots pounding across the floor somewhere further down the hall, getting closer. We all turned our lights toward the sound, and for a split second I swear I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, tall and wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform. Then our lights flickered, all of our phones at the exact same moment, and when they came back on, the hallway was empty. But the running footsteps continued, getting louder, definitely coming our way. Tommy yanked open the door to room 204 and shoved us all inside, pulling it shut behind us. We stood there in complete darkness because our phones had all gone dead. Not just the flashlights, the entire phones wouldn't turn on. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. We could hear breathing, ragged and uneven, and the doorknob started to turn. Ashley let out a small scream, and suddenly the footsteps were running again, but away this time, back down the hall. Our phones all powered on simultaneously, screens bright and showing no sign they'd ever been off. We didn't need to discuss it. We all ran. Not walked, not jogged, but full-on sprinted back through the hallway, down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time and nearly falling. Tommy reached the first floor first and started running toward the cafeteria, the rest of us right behind him. But when we got to the kitchen, the window we'd entered through was different. The plywood that had been partially pried away was now completely intact, freshly nailed with new-looking nails that gleamed in our phone lights. Kevin started pulling at it frantically while Tommy ran to check the main entrance. He came back pale, saying the front doors that had been covered with old rusty nails now had new boards across them too, like someone had just finished securing them. That's when we heard the footsteps again, on the first floor this time, coming from the hallway we'd just left. Daniela found an emergency exit door near the gym that had been hidden behind a fallen locker. The door was rusted shut, but with all 5 of us pulling, we managed to force it open just enough to squeeze through. We ran to Tommy's car without looking back, and he drove out of there so fast the tires kicked up gravel that pinged off the windows. Nobody talked for the first 10 minutes of the drive back. We just sat there, catching our breath and trying to process what had happened. Finally, Kevin pulled out his phone to check the video he'd been recording. The footage was there, but it was all corrupted. Just static and weird visual glitches, except for one clear frame that showed the hallway on the second floor. In that frame, you could see all of us clustered together with our backs to the camera, but there was someone else standing right behind Ashley, close enough to touch her. A man in a janitor's uniform with a name tag we couldn't quite make out. Ashley started crying when she saw it. We never reported it to anyone because what would we even say? That we broke into an abandoned school and got scared? But I did some research afterwards, spending hours in the library going through old newspapers on microfilm. Found an article from 2003 about a janitor named Robert Henley, who'd refused to leave when the school was shut down after the fire. Security found him living in a supply closet on the second floor, said he'd been maintaining empty classrooms and keeping attendance for students who didn't exist. They removed him forcibly, and he was committed to a psychiatric facility. Here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The article mentioned he was released in 2016, just a year before we went there. I drove past the school again last month, during the day this time. The building's been completely demolished, just an empty lot now with a future site of Westfield Shopping Center sign. But I talked to the construction foreman, and he told me something that made my skin prickle. When they were doing the demolition, they found a makeshift living space in the basement. Recent food wrappers, bottles of water, a sleeping bag, and notebooks. Dozens of notebooks filled with attendance records, lesson plans, and the same phrases we'd seen on the walls. The last entry was dated the day after our break-in, and it just said, 5 new students enrolled. They didn't stay for dismissal. The foreman said they turned everything over to the police, but nothing ever came of it. Robert Henley was never found. Sometimes I wonder if he's found another abandoned school somewhere, still taking attendance, still waiting for students who will never come. And sometimes when I can't sleep, I wonder what would have happened if that emergency door hadn't opened, if we'd been stuck there with him overnight, becoming permanent additions to his impossible class. I never thought I'd end up writing about this, but it's something that stuck with me for years. Back when I was in high school, a group of us had this routine of sneaking into places we shouldn't have been. There was an old warehouse complex a couple miles outside of town that everyone talked about. Broken windows, graffiti layered on every wall, and rusted doors that screeched whenever the wind pushed through. It wasn't just one building either. There were multiple connected halls, each darker and more cluttered than the last. For us, it was the perfect spot to kill time on weekends, daring each other to explore further than we had before. That night there were 5 of us: Ethan, Mariah, Caleb, Danielle, and me. We brought flashlights and a Bluetooth speaker pretending we weren't creeped out, but the truth is the place had this heaviness to it. The air smelled like damp concrete and burnt plastic, and there were old pallets stacked in corners that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. We laughed too loudly just to cover the silence. The kind of laughter that feels forced, where everyone's just trying not to acknowledge how tense it actually is. At one point, we ended up sitting on a ledge overlooking the main floor of the largest hall. The moonlight came in through gaps in the broken roof, casting pale streaks across the dusty ground. That's when Ethan stopped mid-sentence and pointed toward the far end of the warehouse. He swore someone was standing near the wall watching us. According to him, the figure was tall, unmoving, and wearing what looked like a rough mask. Something jagged and handmade, like cardboard or plaster that had been broken and pieced together. He said the eyes were just dark holes, fixed straight on us. None of us saw it. By the time we aimed our flashlights in that direction, there was nothing but shadows stretching between collapsed beams. Caleb laughed first, saying Ethan was just trying to spook us. Danielle joined in, teasing him about watching too many horror movies. Mariah rolled her eyes, and I remember feeling this weird mix of relief and doubt. Ethan kept insisting he hadn't imagined it. His voice cracked in a way that didn't feel like a joke, but the more he tried to explain, the less anyone took him seriously. Eventually, we brushed it off and moved on, blasting music louder, pretending nothing strange had happened. Weeks went by, and the warehouse just became another backdrop to our teenage boredom. Ethan still brought it up sometimes, but the more he mentioned the masked figure, the more the rest of us teased him. I felt guilty about that later, because even though I hadn't seen anything that night, the way he described it had been so specific. He never wavered in the details. Same mask, same spot by the wall, same dead stare. Still, life kept moving. School, part-time jobs, trying to scrape together gas money. The warehouse faded into the background, like so many dumb places we used to hang out. Then came winter, and with it, news that shook everyone. A man had been attacked inside the warehouse complex. It wasn't a rumor. This time it was on the local news with squad cars and caution tape wrapped around the entrances we'd once crawled through. The report said the victim survived, but barely. They hinted at multiple suspects, possibly squatters who'd been living there for months. Hearing that made my chest feel heavy. That word, months, stuck with me. It meant that when we were there laughing and mocking Ethan, people might have actually been inside, hidden in the same dark spaces we treated like an adventure. When I saw Ethan after that, he didn't gloat or say, "I told you so." He just looked tired, like he'd carried that memory around and finally had proof he hadn't been crazy. He told me again what he'd seen, the jagged mask, the way the figure never moved, just stood and stared. Now, knowing people had really been living there, it didn't feel like a ghost story anymore. It felt like a warning we hadn't listened to. And suddenly, all the laughter from that night replayed in my head with a sick edge to it. We had ignored the only person who might have seen the attacker long before anything happened. Police never released many details about who they arrested or what was found inside the warehouses. All we knew was that the squatters had been there for a long time, and the place was finally boarded up after the assault. Every time I drove past, I caught myself glancing at the sealed entrances, wondering how many nights those people had been hiding just a few feet from where we'd been joking around. And worse, wondering if the figure Ethan had described hadn't just been watching, but waiting. The hardest part for me wasn't the news report or the caution tape. It was realizing how blind we'd been. We treated Ethan's fear like entertainment, when in reality, he might have been the only one tuned in to the danger surrounding us. I remember lying awake the night after the story broke, replaying every sound from that warehouse. The clatter of loose metal, the drafts that felt too deliberate, the silences between our nervous laughter. Things that once seemed harmless suddenly felt like clues we had ignored. I tried asking one of the officers outside the warehouse if they'd found masks or anything like that, but he brushed me off, saying he couldn't share details. That answer left me stuck in a loop, because if Ethan truly saw someone with a mask, then maybe that wasn't just a squatter blending in. Maybe it was someone already planning something darker, rehearsing in plain sight. The idea that they could stand still and wait while a group of kids joked only yards away makes my stomach churn even now. Eventually, the warehouse was demolished. Where it stood is just an empty gravel lot with weeds poking through. You'd never guess what happened there, or the weight it carries for the handful of us who spent our teenage nights inside. We don't really talk about it anymore. Most of us moved away, scattered into different lives, but every once in a while I'll hear from Ethan. He still remembers that face, or rather that mask, as clearly as the night he saw it, and he never let us forget that he warned us. As for me, I don't go near abandoned places anymore. Not out of superstition, but out of respect for how wrong we got it that night. We laughed when we should have listened, and someone else paid the price months later. I can't say for sure if the masked figure Ethan saw was the same person responsible for the assault, but deep down, I think it was. And that thought stays with me, that sometimes the danger is right there in front of you, silent, patient, and waiting for its turn.